Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing tonight? Good? Cool. Well, my name is Marita Galvan. I'm a second year candidate in the MFA Print Media program, and I'll be introducing the artists today. But first, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. PNCA recognizes and honors the indigenous peoples of this region on whose land the school now stands. These include the Willamette Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Watlala Chinook peoples, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederate tribes of the Grand Ronde, and many other Native communities who made their homes along the Columbia River. We recognize that Portland today is a community of many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, future, and are committed to practices and policies that center Indigenous knowledge, creativity, resilience, and resistance. Gotta take a little breather. We would like to introduce Ronny Quevedo from Guayaquil, Ecuador. Quevedo works in a variety of mediums, including sculpture and drawing. He received his MFA from Yale University and BFA from Cooper Union. Quevedo's work has been exhibited at the Denver Art Museum, the Albright Knox Gallery, Foxy Productions, Upfor Gallery, James Fuentes Gallery, the Whitney Museum of American Art, Socrates Sculpture Park, and the Queens Museum. Solo presentations include Silueta, Rubber Factory, and No Hay Medio Tiempo. There is no halftime, Queens Museum. Group exhibitions include Pacha, Llaqta, Wasichay, Indigenous Space, Modern Architecture, New Art at the Whitney Museum, and the traveling exhibition Monarchs, Brown and Native Contemporary Artists in the Path Butterfly. His work has been reviewed in Art Forum and Hyperallergic. Hello? Okay, sorry about that. His work is held in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Denver Art Museum, and other world-renowned cultural institutions. His work is highlighted in Latinx Art, Artists, Markets, Politics by Arlene Davila. Quevedo is a recipient of a Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship and a Blade of Grass Fellowship for Socially Engaged Art. He has held residencies at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Project Row Houses, and Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. And now I'd like to introduce Matthew Letzeltzer, the chair of the print media program.
Thank you. I'll make this quick. I just want to thank the Edelman family for making tonight possible, as well as the whole week. We've had a week to work with Ronny and make some projects, and also a special thanks to Theo Le Guin for introducing us many years ago. And I'll hand it off to Ronny.
Thanks. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm excited to be back. And I've had a really wonderful time working with the students here and working on a new project, which comes about 2 years in the works. And so I'm really excited about that. So I'd like to thank each of you, Marvin Para, Will Mayers, Sam Oroz, Indo Foltker, Freya Kohler, Lauren Voigt, Lucas Cantoni Jose, Maritza Galvan, and Olive Ritson. You guys have been wonderful to work with, so thank you so much for your time and your effort. I also want to thank Matthew for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure working with the students and getting to know you, and I'm glad we stuck with it over the course of the pandemic. I also don't want to forget, I want to thank Theo Downs Gwyn for making that introduction years ago, as you were the one who brought my work to Portland and to Upfor, and this wouldn't have been possible without that introduction, so thanks. And I'm really happy that these connections, as long as you stay in touch, you never really fray, so I'd like to share that as kind of maybe some knowledge on my part to just stay in touch with all those people that came up with you and stay connected. So thank you all for being here. Just a quick kind of setup of the talk. The first portion is I just want to show a really quick trajectory of some work with some of the ideas behind it. And then the following portion will be really me talking about the specific works in that trajectory bit by bit, and a bit more of a kind of informal process where I'm just kind of describing the work, but also really open to taking any questions or anything that's really unclear as I'm going through it. Thanks. Are we good on sound? Sorry, I just want to make sure. Yeah, thanks. In 2012, I started an investigation of fields and mapping. This started by considering very local, informative environments and materials. I started by looking at the gymnasium and the playground and its various diagrams of boundaries and rules. As I developed the work, I found intersections with older histories of heraldry, symbolism, modularity, and architecture. The artifacts of the Andes before and after conquest surface as abstract symbols of lineage, leading me to look at quipus, tunics, ball courts, sun temples, and landworks as points of departure for drawing, paintings, and sculptures. As I became more aware of the connections with the past and personal, I decided to honor the material history of my own upbringing in order to showcase a type of resourcefulness that echoed the socio-political history of the audience I had in mind. The role of passing, passing down, passing on, passing through, passing the ball, offers a transformative position for the work. This sense of movement is a generative place to investigate the concept of a point of origin. Visibility and fragmentation became core concepts that I continue to investigate. Duality and its various iterations in sport and modularity is also a point of interest. Passing on has generated many works of tribute in order to make this sense of loss become another transformative position. As I move into new scales of working, I aim to maintain a connection to material that recalls a remembered and local environment in which all boundaries are malleable and negotiable. So I go back to this first image from 2012 to talk a little bit about the materials and process that I take on. What you see here is a piece that's about 38 by 50, and at the time I was thinking about different materials that came from my upbringing. Two of the things that came up was this contact paper that resembled a lot of the gymnasium veneer that I grew up going to, the gymnasiums that I grew up going to with my dad when he was a referee for indoor soccer leagues. And at the same time, I was working with this material that my mom had, which was pattern paper. And so I was starting to combine the various things that connected to a really specific history and a very specific biography for me. So here you'll see very thin strips of contact paper cut and applied one by one onto the surface with the pattern paper in green on the perimeter of it. And so as I was working on these pieces, I started thinking more and more about this really specific memory of going with my dad to indoor soccer leagues and what it meant to be at a place where a lot of migrant communities were meeting. And so these were leagues that we would go to every week on Saturday or Sunday, and we would be there for about 6 hours. And it really meant a lot for me to see a gymnasium, especially a gymnasium court in your junior high school or high school, be transformed into a league for your own community. So for me, it was really, really important space to kind of recognize that not all these spaces that are kind of subscribed or prescribed a specific way of functioning could be reinterpreted and taken on to do something else. And so what you see here is these pieces are becoming bigger. This is a 4 by 8 piece where the contact paper again is being applied as if I'm applying the wood one by one onto the ground. This is a detail of it, so you can see a little bit better. And so what I would do is I would screen print onto sheets of contact paper, the full court, and then cut those into 1/4-inch strips that I would apply one by one. And so I'm working on these, and I'm starting to think about the public and private, and thinking about other instances where I'm kind of reconsidering education. And so one thing that came up to me was this idea of the chalkboard and the playground, and thinking about the surface of the blackboard and the surface of black concrete where a lot of the basketball games or the soccer games would exist. And what you also see here is this kind of note-taking of me trying to figure out the proportions for this drawing. So that's kind of some of the math that you see there. And so one thing that I've kind of, I guess, allowed myself to do is just let the work let the process of the work be part of the work. I've also been thinking about how improvisation is a big part of my, I guess it's a concept I want to investigate, and what improvisation means when you're brought into spaces that aren't normally meant for you, or have specific ways of organizing themselves, both to sport, but also coming into a new space, coming from one city into a new city, coming from one country into another country. And so, like I was mentioning before, the work of my mother, who's a seamstress, was coming into the work, and I started really taking that a bit more seriously and thinking about how I can continue to be really diligent about honoring that history, but also the labor and the audience that I want to connect with. And so what you see here is this blue, it's called dressmaker wax paper, and they were used to apply the drawing of a pattern onto fabric. And so what I found really beautiful about this, not only the color, was that this held so much information. You can continually use this transfer paper over and over again. And so what you see are some of the lines from previous drawings, but also this material became the substrate for a lot of the subsequent work. And so here, thinking again about mapping as this opportunity to play with what's being mapped, and so conflating celestial spaces with terrestrial spaces. And so you'll see a relatively simplified mapping of a soccer field in there, as well as a series of constellations in gold on top of that space. And this is a piece that I pay tribute to my dad. Another thing that's been really developing is how installation can be a really big part of the reading and the context of the work. And so I've been really conscious of how the sculptural aspects, or even the elements within an exhibition space, can inform the work. And so this is a installation from the Whitney Museum where I incorporated this basketball hoop, this hoop over here, well, I'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes, which is a sculptural object that I made years ago, as well as this sculpture here, and these pieces on the ground made out of gold. And so what I'm really interested in, how these sculptures and these three-dimensional forms and objects can interact with the work in front of it, behind it, around it. And so the globe was one thing that I was really interested in as something to dissect and really consider to reinvestigate. And so this piece called Errant Globe is an exercise in imagination, thinking about how these objects can be reconsidered and redefined. And a lot of it is really coming from my interest in Edward Glissant's work and the poetics of relation, and thinking about this connection of the center and the periphery always being in constant contact, and being a much more fluid experience and a malleable experience rather than one that is always thinking about the other as a finite place, or a finite existence. And so from that project, or I guess from that sculpture, I started developing this series of works. They're relatively small. These are about 10 by 13, so it's a quarter that sheet that I showed you before, and it allowed me to create various images because I found out that if I just make one impression, I can keep the copy and then the drawing that I was making. So it just allowed for multiple images, like multiple versions of the same image. And so here I'm starting to consider the globe as a space that needs to be reconsidered and redefined for me. And some of the beginning drawings are pretty straightforward, I guess. So thinking about the standard grid that you would see placed on a globe and redefining that. And also thinking about different vantage points, how sometimes you don't consider the globe from above or consider the globe from below. And so this was one iteration of that idea. I was also thinking about how we kind of learn about the globe and different methods of learning about the globe, or how we come to understand space. And so one interest that I had was kind of thinking about this encyclopedia that I grew up with called Groyler's Encyclopedia, which was just fascinating to me because it was like all this knowledge that was available in 26 volumes, and I could just keep going through it, and what that meant as a place that kind of was contained, like all this knowledge was contained, but I also felt like the things were missing. So this piece is called End Papers, where usually you would find the map of the world on the inside and outside of these encyclopedias. And another thing that, as I was going through this, is thinking about other artists that have taken on this approach. And so this piece is dedicated to Jack Whitten and his work, and he's also someone that was really influenced by Edward Glissant, and someone who is also very interested in our kind of connection to knowledge, but also thinking about photography in painting. And so this one is a piece that I dedicated to him. As I'm working on them, textiles and this kind of modular way of working is coming into play, and I'm thinking, I guess more concretely how this connects with my mother's history as a seamstress, but also the patterns that come from fabric. And one thing that was coming to mind was this kind of a connection to Andean textiles and their relative simplicity in presenting geometric abstraction and new geometric forms. And so I think in a way this was a really great exercise to kind of start connecting not only to the globe, but how visual language is developed and formed. And as I'm working on these, I'm realizing that artifacts is also, specific artifacts are becoming really interesting to me. And so in this case, this is a quipu. For those of you not familiar with it, a quipu is a series of threaded knots that used to be a counting system in the Andes. And this was before and during conquest. So a lot of these quipus and artifacts are really well preserved because a lot of them were buried and existed were buried with specific figures in the desert. And so they're really well preserved, and there's hundreds of them still being kind of preserved or being shown. And what I found interesting about it is that a lot of the context for these things are not necessarily available. So it's this really well intact artifact from a specific place, a specific culture, and yet that information is not necessarily available to us. And so this kind of fragmented sense of past and knowledge is something that has also been really significant to me and kind of impacted a lot of the way that I not only make work, but the way that I think about the span of time and the type of connections that I want to make within my work. This is a piece dedicated to Cecilia Vicuña, who's another artist that is very fascinated by the quipu. So in this case, thinking about the quipu as another type of mapping, right? So the artifact is accounting for something, but potentially here this is mapping a lineage that I'm not familiar with or unaware of. I just want to kind of point something out, like this process that I was telling you about. You can kind of see a remnants of the previous drawing here. So this is a vertical piece, but this is the horizontal version. So you can see some of those press lines on this piece, on this one here, as kind of a ghost image. And also playing with this, having a little bit of fun with the kind of modular symbols that exist already, and thinking about soccer balls in particular, and thinking about how there's this really nice balance of like the kind of iconic image of a soccer ball with the pentagon and hexagon. And so taking some of those existing models and playing with it. So here the same system applies, it's just a different kind of iteration of each pentagon, each hexagon. So these next few images, I guess they probably illustrate, they do illustrate a little bit of what I've been talking about already, this connection to transfer, and iteration, and thinking about iteration being a key part of my process, and how the recording of the mark has been really, really interesting to me, and how I can kind of maximize that mark, right? So it kind of came from this fear of messing up the first drawing. So I was like, okay, if I'm scared of messing this up, maybe I could just do it once and it'll be recorded 3 times over. So the process is relatively simple. I'll just have a sheet of paper on top with the carbon paper underneath, and then another sheet on below that. And so I'm pressing into a blank sheet of paper with a bone folder and kind of creating an invisible drawing, so to speak. And what you see here is the first, these white lines are the first marks on that paper, which is a track and field. And so what I wanted to think about was how can I kind of make a project in a space that doesn't exist yet for me? Like, how can I work in a stadium? Because I had these ideas of like, oh, what can I do in a stadium? What can happen? And so this was one connection to the Nazca lines, which are these geoglyphs in Peru that are just monumental earthworks. And so thinking about incorporating something to that scale within a stadium. And then going back again to the soccer field as a site of convening, but also this place of meditation. So thinking about duality here very specifically just to the 2 sides of the field. And as I'm working on this, realizing that there's this connection in a very kind of formal way to a mirror that belonged to an Inca priest, and how this kind of form of the track is also kind of modular to this image of a 2-headed serpent kind of eating itself. You can kind of make that out a little bit here. So this would be kind of this image that ends up eating itself. I hope that kind of makes sense. And another piece that's really significant to the work is the symbol of the huifala, which is essentially a flag that represents a specific region of the Inca Empire. More recently, it's taken on the role of representing the indigenous communities of the Andes throughout the 4 countries. So it's, for me, it was fascinating for various reasons, because it was it kind of resembled a coat of arms. Like it's a system, it's a code that to indicate a specific kind of sovereignty, but it's also very formal. It's kind of like this modular thing that can kind of be reinterpreted over and over again. And I was making this connection with more contemporary sense of heraldry, at least for me, and thinking about sports and thinking about basketball teams, and this one particularly. So this is the Sacramento Kings and the Atlanta Hawks logo at that time, and wanting to play with this connection to an older history of heraldry. So the checkerboard and the modular possibilities really become a big part of the work. It's something I'm still really interested in as kind of this generative position of a history that's kind of connected to me, but something that is also readily available. So this is one example of just a drawing, practicing with different materials. And so what you see here is I've created a few templates of this checkerboard pattern and ironing carbon paper on top of it, so I get that relief. I mean that what's the word I'm looking for? Once I iron the carbon paper, I get the kind of negative of that, right? And then on top of that, I'm applying smaller sheets of wax paper just ironed onto the surface. And so it's kind of building up the image bit by bit. And in 2017, I finally got an opportunity to do these drawings I've been working on to scale. So when I was working on all these pieces about indoor soccer leagues, I always imagined them to be built out. I always thought, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be really cool to just make my own gym floor and really start thinking about this space as something that we can inhabit and exist in. And so in 2017, I had the opportunity to make this piece at full scale for the first time. The floor of the museum is already wood. So what I ended up doing was just applying several pieces of vinyl onto the floor and create the drawing, and have this soccer ball that you see here on the bottom that was covered in chalk. And so what I ended up doing for that project was to cover the ball with chalk like every 2 or 3 weeks and create this really abstract drawing in the space. And what I found really interesting about that is kind of creating kind of a playful tension between the viewer and the project and them not knowing exactly what to do. But what I also found really interesting is in order for them to participate, they kind of had to erase the image, right? So there was this really nice conflation kind of inversion of how one operates and one contributes to something by erasing it. So this is what the piece looks like from above. It's it's about 35 feet by 90 feet, and this is all vinyl. Yeah, it was about 4 weeks of sitting on the floor, getting that done, mapping everything out. And one thing that I really feel has always kind of been part of the work is thinking about drawing as a sculptural practice and thinking about the way that the disciplines and the mediums that I work in can be pushed a little bit further. So whether someone wants to call it a print or a drawing, I do find this to be do find it as an opportunity to see, well, how much further can that process go? And so when people ask me about the work, it's really tough sometimes to define it solely as drawing, solely as sculpture, solely as printmaking or painting. And so I show this piece here because this is something I'm really proud of as a project, because it's in the same museum. So at the Queens Museum, in New York City, it's surrounded. The Queens Museum exists in a very large public park where a huge population of migrants, migrant communities come to play sports. There's many numbers of like a lot of soccer fields that are operated throughout the year, and these are also the fields I went to with my dad. And so for me, it was kind of a coming back to this place that I grew up in. And so one thing that I want to kind of pay tribute to was this connection to the population outside of the space. And so, sorry, one other thing which I think is important to point out, that the Queens Museum was also the space, it housed the UN for 6 years before the UN moved to the city. And so there's this kind of connection to the architecture of the building as being connected to that history. So what I did, what I requested was that all the flags that were flying to be brought down, so there was a US flag, the Parks flag, and the New York flag was brought down for the duration of the show, and the 4 flags of that represent the Inca Empire were flown throughout for the duration of the exhibition. And so it was a kind of a way to kind of pay tribute to these various lineages, because the boundaries of that geography aren't the boundaries of the geography of now, but it's a very similar lineage. And so I wanted to kind of make that connection with a history and a kind of abstract or fragmented past, and thinking about the Andes in particular. So soon after that, I was invited to do a project at Socrates Sculpture Park, and so I was able to expand the scale of the project, and now I'm working with actual reclaimed wood from gymnasium floors and applying the same approach of drawing on it and applying gold leaf on it, and so people could interact with this piece over the course of the year as it was a public park. Another thing that's really kind of coming out of the work is thinking about appropriation as a form of resistance and a tribute to the urban landscape. And so for me, it was a way to connect again with my upbringing, thinking about the Bronx, thinking about New York, and thinking about how certain architecture and certain objects of the urban landscape were redetermined, right? So if you took a milk crate, you can cut out the bottom and turn it into a basketball hoop. And I was also interested in how that connected to the history of the ball game in Mesoamerica. And so some of you may be familiar with these ball hoops made out of cement that exist in Mesoamerica. And it was this game called Ulama that was really significant, not only to the culture, but also to the architecture of Mesoamerica. And so I wanted to pay tribute to that. And so in order to make these connections a little bit more direct, or I guess more specific, I started making pieces that are really connected to the reference or the referent that I had in mind. And so what you see here is a pencil drawing of Chichen Itza in Mexico. And thinking, this is all, I can't remember the scale, but this is what you would see of the ball court. So at the top up here, these two are the areas from which you would view the game, and this section here, these 4 posts, is where you would, you would enter the space. And so I wanted to make a connection between the past and present, and thinking about how these 2 places kind of combine and create a new space. And so again, the process of contact paper, screen printing, some digital printing, and kind of keeping it interesting for myself too. This drawing is created by an initial blue line, which was a basketball strategy, and then after that, kind of giving myself rules of like not letting the next line touch the previous line, changing the thickness of these lines, and so it was this kind of play on the drawing to showcase the movement of players and bodies in and out of that space. This is a piece with a reference to the zoot suit. And so for me, thinking about the zoot suit was thinking about a very specific point in time where a new identity is being formed. And so the history of the zoot suit's kind of an interesting one, where this fashion of creating a garment that's oversized is happening at the same time where there's a war going on, and so there's a rationing on fabric. And so this starts in Chicago and becomes a kind of icon of jazz and African American experience. And then it also becomes a really iconic garment for the Chicano movement, and thinking about this way of representing oneself that's kind of in contrast to what's happening. So for me, what I found interesting about Chicano culture and this kind of presentation of being from Mexico and being from the US simultaneously, I found that interesting for me because it was like, oh, maybe this is something that I kind of want to pay tribute to, something that I found was this kind of conscious presentation of duality. And it was something that was kind of stylistic, but also allowed multiplicity to exist in its making. And so this is the first one that I made in connection to the zoot suit. And so what you see here is several layers of a zoot suit pattern on top of each other. And then the next one is more kind of allowing the pattern of the zoot suit to exist just on its own without any indication of language and only numbers on the space. And so what I did here was apply, the process that I'm doing here is applying gold leaf to the back of pattern paper and then pressing that onto muslin. And afterwards, eliminating any indication of written language, allowing only numbers to exist. As I'm working on them, the body's really becoming an important factor in thinking about how to represent the body. I mean, I'm not a figurative painter, and it was something that just kind of came about, thinking about who are the bodies that I'm thinking of representing in these spaces. And one person, that I want to continue to pay tribute to was this, or I want to pay tribute to my dad, who passed away in 2008, and thinking about his position as a referee and this kind of responsibility he had to time, which I found really fascinating, where he is given this kind of, he's given a responsibility to determine what's on and what's off, when it starts, when it stops, what's fair, what's foul. And I indicated that by reinterpreting a quipu in 45 segments. And so that's what you see here in the center, this kind of quipu coming from the center out. And what I really appreciated about this was that somehow all these formal elements that seem, I wouldn't say benign, but potentially simple, started having layers of symbolism for me. And so I kind of kept thinking about the quipu, kept thinking about this sense of arbitrating, being an arbiter of time. And so I made another piece as a way of paying tribute to him again. And also the material is starting to inform the work. So at this, from the very beginning, I'm only allowing myself to work with objects that are coming from fabric stores, other than the gold and silver, which have their own symbolism. All these lines are actually strips of wax paper that are cut to that size and then melted onto the surface. And the pattern paper is actually ironed onto muslin. And so muslin becomes the substrate that I want to work on continuously. This is another quipu, thinking about it being reimagined. This is a piece dedicated to Edward Glissant. And this is another iteration, a reconsideration of a painting from Ecuador, and thinking about the histories of Ecuador that are being left out. And so this piece is dedicated to the work of, not the work, but the painting of Don Arrobe and his two sons, which is it was an enslaved state that rebelled and took over that geographic area of Ecuador and reclaimed it for the enslaved people. Carbon paper is also becoming a big part of the practice, and thinking about this connection to carbon and kind of reducing material down to its kind of bare structure or bare substance. And so what I'm doing here is, again, ironing out a lot of imagery from the substrate, from the carbon paper, and then putting gold leaf behind it. So what you see is kind of a really subdued brilliance of the gold. This is another piece called Migration Lines, where I'm thinking about textiles, but also mapping. And so what you see are longitude and latitude lines, just kind of splayed out simply. And then in, I guess, when was this? 2021, I believe. I was invited to recreate that piece I showed you before at Socrates Sculpture Park. And I was fortunate to work with a curator who was wanting to scale the project up even further. And so the piece that you see here is actually 24 by 64 feet. And so I was able to go up to Buffalo and source a new gymnasium floor, or I guess a used gymnasium floor, and remount it in the space. And so what you see here is all gymnasium floors sourced from that area with another vinyl drawing on top of it. And it also gave me an opportunity to reconsider how to present these works on muslin. And so I was thinking about how the paintings or these objects that also function as textiles can be seen from various viewpoints. And so I kind of thought about them as players and objects that exist in a space, so you can see them from multiple angles. And so this is one of those works titled Revolutions Unbound. And again, at this point, I'm still only limiting myself to the work, to the wax paper and the muslin. So all the marks that you see here are through pressing that carbon paper onto the surface, or by ironing that paper onto the surface, and trying to see how much further I can build up the painting and the piece. So again, the track and field's coming back into consideration, thinking about the movement of bodies within that space. And I'm also starting to reconsider how I can make these works. And so this is actually a piece that I collaborated with my mom. And we kind of both were kind of interacting and seeing how to register a line onto the surface. The blue lines that you see there are actually sewn into the work with a sewing machine. and then the white lines are screen printed onto the surface. Then in 2021, soon after that, I was asked to do a similar project at Colorado College, and was fortunate again to be able to source a basketball court, actually from here. Yeah, I just realized it was from the Portland Trailblazers' old, like, either practice facility or their actual facility, the actual stadium, and the Portland Fire. So we were able to source the wood from Portland and bring it to Colorado and create another space. And what I really found interesting about the development of these pieces of sculptures, and in a sense architecture, is how to create a space for contemplation, reconsider what a playing field can do and how it can operate. And so in addition to thinking about this place of convening and this place of like serious collaboration, was this moment where the individual act is hugely influential to the kind of communal experience. And so I was thinking about the free throw, and I was thinking about the penalty, and I was thinking about the moment of individual effort within a collective. And so what I ended up sourcing from those two teams was the free throw line, and the area where the one person who's kind of really on the spot to make the most of their moment for the collective experience. And this was it was an interesting experience to, I guess, conceptually trying to think about the role of collaboration and the role of kind of convening and the role of teamwork, and this kind of connection to the self, but allowing that place to exist as a place of reflection, and kind of considering what one offers to that space. One thing that's been really fun about working sculpturally is how these works, they offer new modes of representation, both as painting, drawings, artworks, but also as responses to the architecture. And so this piece is actually hanging from the ceiling it's actually about this tall. I think this is about 18 feet. And so the piece is hanging down. And again, you're able to see it from multiple sides. Well, what I found interesting about it, I guess interesting to me, I hope you guys, it's very simple, but it's like the idea that one plane can exist as two planes, and then all of a sudden there's like a reconsideration what this thing can be or what it can do. And as a simple kind of gesture of just like strips of pattern paper built on top of each other. And this is from 2022, again, thinking about how the sculptural components and the modular components can continually add to one another. And so this is a piece, I'm trying to remember it's 80 by 80. So the bottom base is 80 by 80, and then the other two platforms are kind of proportionally half of that piece. And so you kind of get this like step pyramid, but it's also a very simple grid, and thinking about how I can turn this kind of way of working on the grid into a sculptural mode of working. So these pieces were able to be removed and repositioned throughout the exhibition. We ended up having an artist talk on one of these and sitting on the other one. So it was just kind of this kind of reconsideration of what the sculpture can do and what it can't do. So I just want to see how much. Yeah, good. And this is a project that was completed in 2022. It's part of a commission for the new airport terminal, or LaGuardia Airport. And I bring it up because I find it really, I don't know, I find it interesting to see the development of a drawing into a final sculpture 10 years after the fact. And so I bring this up really to showcase that this evolution of a drawing schematic did kind of become the thing that I was hoping for. And it was through various iterations and modes of working that I was able to kind of make this possible. But again, thanks to Theo, I was able to make it legible to a lot of people, which is also really important. And so the shift in scale was really interesting for me because it starts making me consider not just as a static object, but also an object in space and how it exists over time. And so one thing that I wanted to do was to make sure that the gold leaf and the silver leaf that's in it, part of the work, and there's no real image that can capture this, but the idea is that the gold leaf allows this piece to exist differently over the course of time and over the course of the day. You know, so as you're going from the third floor to the first floor, this piece changes and is illuminated differently. And so this kind of modular connection to making and visual imagery is something that has really and continues to inform a lot of the decisions in the studio, but also allows for a lot of experimentation and reconsideration again of some of the references that I have. So what you see, I just kind of want to point out these kind of these linear forms here are actually copper tubing that are all the same size. So there's kind of L-shaped so that they can create various iterations of a sculpture. So those are actually coming from this connection of the soccer posts that we would have to put together for soccer games, but also thinking about the architecture of the Andes and thinking about how that architecture was modular and kind of one thing was connecting to the other, and how this response to space was that the response to space was a kind of holistic response to space, that it's not just about creating something that is completely unique, but that it's somehow connected to its original point. And so I'm not sure if I'm making sense here, but what I really appreciate is the kind of economics of it, or the simplicity of it, that one shape can be iterated and be incredibly generative over and over again. And it's also starting to inform the way the drawings or the works on the wall are interpreted. And so what was nice is kind of creating these sight lines from the sculpture into the works on the wall. I mentioned duality before and the various ways that it's discussed, and one concept and one author that I've been thinking a lot about is Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who's Bolivian and has written a lot about this term chixi, which she uses I think the best analogy is thinking about gray, and thinking about how gray is both black and white at the same time, yet its own color. And so that while there's this duality, there's also multiplicity in presenting that duality. And it's something that's really stuck with me in thinking about my own upbringing, you know, coming from Ecuador, moving to the Bronx, where there really wasn't an Ecuadorian community. And so for me, thinking about, you know, growing up with salsa, hip hop, reggae, merengue all around me, as a foundation, right? It wasn't something that I kind of learned about. It was something that was surrounding me and informing me and really formative. And so I just felt like this term of Chiksi was really crucial because it's the beginning, right? It's like, while it represents duality and multiplicity, it's also very much a foundation for me, or a common ground. So this piece is dedication to that one. Again, the process with screen gold leaf on the back, screen printing on top of it, and then cut into strips. So this kind of notion of fragmentation feels very present, but also hopefully not completely unstable. It's somehow a container for this fragmentation and this multiplicity. And so this comes up again in thinking about opposition, thinking about hemispheres. This here just thinking about silver and gold, silver being representing the moon, and gold representing the sun in Andean symbolism. This is one that I was thinking about the solar system, again, in this very kind of topographical way, and connecting it to the vinyl records, and thinking about hip hop as also a really big source of influence for me. This one is the sun and moon again coming together and creating a new space potentially. And I'd mentioned before how gold and silver are becoming, well, I guess the notion of passing of time as part of the work. And so in this one, some portions of the silver are coated to not oxidize, and other portions of silver are left to continually oxidize over time. Through this process, a lot of the mapping and the abstraction is a way of recalling an unknown. And so while the grid is a relatively recognizable symbol, I'm also thinking about how to undermine that, how to alter it, how to really question the neutrality of the grid. This is also coming from the previous drawing. And here the mapping is coming from pattern paper, while the surface on top is this interaction between the yellow and blue wax paper literally melting on the surface. And more recently in December, I was invited to do a project at Locust Projects in Miami, and the approach that I took was trying to get a sense of what the soccer leagues were like there, and specifically the hopefully indoor soccer leagues, and connecting with the commissioners of those leagues and getting to know a little bit about their history and how and why they formed their leagues. And so the connection to soccer comes from my dad's history as a professional soccer player, his history as a referee, and for me, it's also it was never really about the competition. Also, although the competition is very much part of like the excitement of it, what I've always been interested in, how it's this place of convening, how it's this place of connecting people. And so what I decided to do was to paint the whole gallery white and have people play in the space um, right before the exhibition was open to the public. And so what we did was we had people come into the space. These lines were already in the space, and we had them play 20-minute matches over the course of a weekend. And so there were various leagues, various skills playing in the space, and we covered these felt balls with ink and chalk and just allowed people to play in the space. And so some of the marks that you see there are from that. You can see how the brass sculptures are very much functioning as goalposts in the place. This is some of the results of the work on the floor. And so it creates this really interesting connection with the work and connection with the drawings, and thinking about what planning and improvisation has to offer, and this kind of dialectic between the two. And so what I feel has been really generative about the work is how there is this kind of mapping of a space that doesn't exist, but it comes from a very specific history, at least for me, and what improvisation has to offer. What does it mean to kind of be malleable and kind of acclimate? What does it mean to reappropriate things to offer a new viewpoint or a new position? And so I'll end here with a piece that I did in 2019, and looking at how the shift in sight and thinking about the work beyond painting, beyond drawing, beyond printmaking, beyond these disciplines, or I guess descriptors of the work, and kind of just allowing the way we inhabit these spaces to be the kind of bigger function in the reading of the work. Thank you. Happy to take any questions. Yeah. Yeah. I'll just repeat the question because I think there's people online. You're asking me if I do any sketching in like a 4D or 3D kind of way. Yeah, I love making models of all this stuff, and if I knew some of the 3D software, I would probably be sketching in it. But I think my connection to the way architecture is drawn has always been really interesting to me. So even though it's kind of topographical, it still feels very two-dimensional to me. But I love working within models of specific environments, you know, like even if it's a small gallery or a booth, like I'm just sketching stuff out because those relationships really matter to me. The way people interact with the work in person really matters to me. So yeah, I do. Yeah. Yeah, Amanda. Hi. Yeah. 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 Yeah, it's kind of developed over time. I think initially I was interested in them as um, strategy, like the way you indicate strategy. And then when I started investigating the globe, I realized that different um, symbols can indicate space in a specific way, like arrows and with the type of arrow, even the thickness of line. What does that mean? And then I got to the point where I was really interested in the patterns, and so the patterns started representing this similar kind of indication of the body, right? And so what I've been interested in is how they both indicate space in a macro level and a micro level. What I find interesting about the patterns is that they, like, I can't read them. Like, my mom's a seamstress, she understands what that means, but I don't know exactly what that means. And so it's interesting to me where legibility comes into comes into play, and what the meaning of the direction is supposed to be. So yeah, it's yeah, the directional aspect of it is also crucial because it's ever changing, right? It's another instance where, like, it's a kind of collective understanding of what that symbol means, right? You can undermine it or you can reinterpret it to hopefully fulfill a different purpose. Yeah, I hope that clarifies. Yeah. Hi. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the research has been a big part of it because I try not to sound like a dummy. And I think it's also been really crucial to get a sense of the context in which the places I want to remark on, what the context was at the time. So, reading about the conquest and the time frame of that has been really important, but also understanding how some of these tunics who were they made for, and what it meant to have excavated them, right? So knowing full well that it really meant someone went into a mound and dug it out, right? And that was not an act that was collectively agreed upon. So, but the other interesting is, like, a lot of these things are still kind of held and archived. And, like, I recently had a fellowship, the Smithsonian, and they had all these stone seats from Ecuador that I've been really interested in. And so I was able to go there and see them in person. In that case, the person who removed them documented every step of the way really well. That's not always the case for a lot of these artifacts. But as I'm kind of researching them and thinking about what these objects mean, the connection that I have to them changes in that the fragmentation is still there. It's a bit more informed. But I guess I'm thinking of how to, like, how do I parse that awkward, I wouldn't even say it's indifference, but like that awkward kind of tension between this object that was removed from its site, right? And my kind of reconnecting to it. and I don't want to be romantic about it. I'm not trying to like build upon a narrative that is uninformed. So the research part is important to me, at least on a very personal level, and trying to think about what is the connection I have to these things. And so I think even in thinking about the history of my mom and dad, wanting to know that even further. So research is a big part of my practice, and trying to make time to stay connected. And what's funny, I think, for me is that a lot of the research that I do is kind of in archaeology and not in the arts, right? And so I'm like trying to, as I try to widen the references that I have, it's also realizing that a lot of it is in like this other section, right? And that's where the real kind of meat and bones of it is. Yeah. Yeah. Hey. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's mostly as I'm working on them. It's like a process. I have like a set parameters of like I want it to be this big or so many colors, but I think most of the time as I'm working on the work on the drawing or in the piece, there's like, oh, there's this line up here, maybe I'll continue it, right? And then now I want to recreate this other pattern. So it's more of a process oriented thing. Yeah. Yes.
I have a related question, which is, do you ever think about the professional role that you play as an artist through the lens of sports? And like, have you ever like made a uniform for yourself? Do you think of yourself as an athlete in some ways? And
Yeah.
has that brought you closer to the power of the movement?
I think the discipline part of being an artist still like I hope, right? But because there's also a lot of artists that wanted to be athletes, like David Hemmons wanted to be a basketball player for a long time, or somebody else, I can't remember. But it's like a lot of artists want to be musicians, right? And I think the way I think about my role as an artist is kind of building upon that idea of it as a practice, like going in every day, having a set time, a set schedule, committing to it, staying on top of it, and then realizing, like once you're in it, like, oh, to stay on top of it, like now I got to do this other thing now. Like now I got to read this other book. I got to read this other history of textiles, right? And so like keeping myself informed, so like I can keep it interesting for myself, but also be like I'm still on top of the game, and so to speak. Yeah. But I haven't made a uniform for myself. I've made uniforms for imagined people, but not for myself. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. it was liberating. Like I didn't have to do any of the work. But no, in a way, it was really fun because it was like this way of like, it was a simple question of like, how can I reconsider a drawing? Like, how can I kind of take on this idea of a drawing or like a game and turn it on to its head or give it to somebody else? And when we figured out, and I say we because I have an assistant who's helping me with a lot of this stuff, is figuring out the right density of ink so it doesn't come off on the player, but it comes off on the wall. So it was like, we found a way to do it, and then the chalk was always an option. And what I liked about it, because it was a foundational question of like, what is a drawing? Like, I think that was a driver. Like, what is a drawing? And how can you, once you figure out, I was like, okay, I can make a drawing out of this ball covered in chalk and ink. It's like, oh, now can I pass it on, literally pass it on to somebody else? And then you realize that, oh, there could be a game played out of all of this. So it started with a relatively simple question, I felt. And I think if that kind of introspection and investigation can be carried on or passed on to somebody else, and it's an interesting question for everyone, then it's a really good space for collaborating, right? And so like you just like, here's the ball, like go make a drawing. So yeah, I hope that answers a bit. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it started, so that first image, I always show this image in every talk that I have because it was really, really important to me. It came from a series of drawings. This came after the fact. I did a series of drawings where I put myself in the position of my dad at the age that I was, where he was at that time. So I was 30 when I made the drawing that I'm talking about, and so I put myself in his place, about to enter into a soccer field, only knowing Spanish, only having gone to grade school. You know, like I try to place myself in that, in his mind. And so there was this really conceptual kind of expansion of what the mark was supposed to mean and what the history of these places that I wanted to represent meant, right? And another thing that I do is continually go back to what these objects represent to my upbringing and both my parents, right? And so in honoring that, I felt like that started taking up this notion that is really popular, where sometimes it's presented to you as a way to be taken as a serious artist. You have to kind of shadow or potentially mimic the histories of other artists, right? And so I just didn't see any connections there for myself. But I saw a lot of structure and a lot of modeling from my parents as people who moved from one place to a new one and made that existence possible. So in a sense, I just started thinking, I started widening my points of reference. And so in order to do that, I had to widen it really far, really, you know, thinking about the Andes, thinking about before conquest, thinking about before the Inca, thinking about before a lot of things. It just, and I try to be mindful not to make it feel like I'm being romantic or, an essentialist, because I don't want to, I don't want to stereotype anything. I don't want to make it feel like I'm not aware of what I'm doing. But it was really important to me to kind of widen the history that I wanted to represent. And so in doing that, I also started making a more conscious effort. I was like, okay, the work is abstract. Like, there's no way around it. Like, it has to be abstract because I kind of don't know what I'm talking about. Like, I don't know what I want to say. At least that's what I thought, right? And then as I'm working on it, realizing that this kind of fragmentation, this repositionality, this this emergence and deconstruction of a space is all happening at the same time for me. And so if I can represent that visually, then it will be palpable. I feel like it will be connecting to something. So yeah, I think it was a real investigation of what it meant to be my dad that kind of spawned a lot of these works. Yeah. One last question. Yeah. It's a little bit of both initially. It's just I wanted this to be a stadium project. I still want this to be a stadium project, right? And I hope one day somebody will want it to be a stadium project. So, it wasn't a strategy that I had in mind. It just happened, like, I really love architecture. I really love making things to scale. And so I started making them and realizing that, oh, these actually work sculpturally as well, but they don't have to be entirely exactly as I wanted to, right? Like, when I did the Queens Museum show, I was like, all right, I'll just work with vinyl. Like, the idea will still be present, but it doesn't have to be like a whole full-fledged construction, right? So it's a bit of both. It's like presenting the idea to some people and like showing them that you've been working a specific way for a long time. And then somebody saying, hey, I would love to do that, but we can only do it at a quarter of the scale. Totally fine. Like, as long as the concept is still generating a new physical representation of it. And then other people, so sometimes they'll see it and they'll be like, I want that in our space. And those have happened as well. So, yeah, what I would say is, like, as long as the concept is what's driving those decisions, whether it be painting, a drawing, a print, or architectural installation, it'll just keep feeding itself for working up or working down. Yeah, sure. Thank you.